I thank you. Good evening, everyone. I would like to call this meeting to order and acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Ojibwe, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. My name is Carrie Linklater, and I'm the chairperson this evening, and I am joined on the panel via Zoom by Ms. Kira Penner and Mr. Richard Whitbread. From the assessment department is Mr. Matthew Barocas, and our administrative personnel is Ms. Twinkle Sharma. This evening, we will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by City Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket this evening. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. This evening, we will be hearing items 4 and 5 on the docket. And Ms. Sharma, would you please affirm the assessor and the applicant's testimony?
Sure. Mr. Assessor, please state your full name.
Matthew Barocas.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to provide at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Applicant, please state your full name.
Sarah Cates.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to provide at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Ms. Cates and Mr. Barocas. And we are going to be starting with item number 4 on the docket, which is 251 Edgeland Boulevard. And we are looking at assessed value. And Mr. Barocas, whenever you're ready.
Oh, sorry, else disappeared. One moment. File 24-3254. Roll number 12073855000 251 Edgeland Boulevard. Total assessed value is $7,432,000. 426,000 of it is institutional classified property. It's exempt. It's not under dispute, so I won't talk about it. The grantable, the taxable, or the grantable liability rather, classification 20T, $7,006,000. Actually, year built 1973. It's got 119 suites, 71 outdoor parking spots. No recent sales. So On to page 3, 119 units, 94 of them are bachelors, 24 are one bedroom. One of them is a 2 bedroom, according to our records. Average monthly rent's quite low, especially for the area. $687.69. So for the apartment portion, it's all model parameters. We got this pegged down to poor in our model to take into account the size. And it's got a higher expense ratio also, 60%, which is probably too high. If you ask me, but that's what the models put out. So that's what we're going with. 5.4 cap. It's only 58,873 per unit. 7,006,000 is on the grantable part that we're talking about. Rent comps here are on page 5. Unless something's changed, we don't have a disagreement in regards to the net operating income. It's just a cap rate discussion for the grantable, and we are at 5.4. So it is CMHC market rent analysis, which we are familiar with, I'm sure, on 5 and 6. And we've got it pegged down in our model. So taking into account the unit composition, inclusive of the area, the age, and the unit count, we're only at 71% of what CMHC is saying out to be. So it's quite low, actually. This property, it's like adjacent to Tuxedo Park Shopping Mall. It's got a Safeway there, Rumors, if you're familiar with the area. It's between Corden and Tuxedo, so it's actually quite a nice area, if you ask me. We've got our CMHC tables here on page 7. One thing I would like to point out is that even though we're only at $687 rents, if you look at the chart, the very first chart, that's about $80 less than the core area zones 1 and 4 October 22 rents. So that's for bachelors. So I'm saying the rent is probably too low considering the area that it's in. And there's probably a pretty big lineup to get into Tuxedo under $700 a unit, even if it is a bachelor, in my opinion. So then we got a cap table on page 8, and then another overall 20th to 80th percentile inclusive table, and some of the, I guess, brokers with the ranges they're giving on page 9. Then on page 11, there's a permit to change out the windows back in 2008 on a 13-story apartment building to the tune of about $500,000. You got a photograph on page 12. One thing to note, there is a big empty space if you look beside the building. I think that probably would ought to qualify as excess land. Like it looks like it could be sectioned off and sold. I really doesn't have any additional value in regards to our workup, even though in reality it probably should. So that's something that we're going to be taking a look at after this hearing going forward. But you can see the exterior of the building there on page 12, and then on page 13, just some Google Street View imagery. So it does not have air conditioning. You can tell by the window shakers there on page 13. And then you can just see the size of the excess land. On page 15, so it's looks like it's independent living, like it is a Manitoba housing property. So we're not looking at the actuals. One thing to note is that the rent that they're asking is in regards to 327 square foot bachelors and 431 to 645 square foot one bedroom. So again, the units are quite small. Smaller than market, but again, it is in Tuxedo and are really low on the rent. So I think at $58,000 per unit, I really didn't see anything there for me to make a change. I think it was open to everyone at this asking rent. There'd be a lot of people trying to get in there. So no change to the overall assessment inclusive of the institutional exempt, 7,432,000. That's my evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Cates, any questions?
Yes, thank you. So in regard to the property's suite sizes, so you mentioned during your presentation that it does have a high proportion of small suites. Would you agree that smaller suites, mostly bachelors under like 400 square feet, may be less desirable to the market?
Well, I mean, at this rent level, I don't think they'd have a problem getting people in there. If they raise the rents, then maybe the corresponding size might be too big. Or sorry, the corresponding size might be too small. I think, especially when you compare it to the CMHC, we're only 70%, and we're less than like the core area overall stats for a bachelor. I think we're good just based on the rents being so low.
Okay. And then in terms of your income value summary on page 3, this would be counting the property as a low-end market rental, not as social housing. Is that fair to say?
Right, yeah. So we have the income quality put to poor to reflect in our model that it would be commanding lower rents, and that can be like for any multitude of reasons based on its expected condition, or in this case, like the size of the suites, but not intrinsic to any sort of site-specific use.
Okay. And then in terms of your CMHC rent tables on page 5 and 6, given that the CMHC data is averages, and especially looking at the area, it's probably going to be pulled up by renovated or newer developments, it would make sense for social housing to be below CMHC rents, would it not?
Yeah, absolutely, it would, unless this one got a big refresh, which we have no record of, so that's not what we're assuming. But yeah, typically they're utilitarian and they show various levels of wear.
Okay. And then your cap rates on page 8, you only have the final values, not the workups for those. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that would conclude my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Penner, any questions?
I was just wondering if I noticed that there's quite a shortage of parking for the units. There's not a stall for each unit. Would that have any impact on the value?
I mean, that's what we have on record, so it's not like we're attributing any sort of income to parking that's not there. So that number of parking stalls is accounted for in the valuation intrinsically in terms of the income.
I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Whitbread.
Sure, I'll ask a couple. I can't recall if you said this is income supported, but we don't have financials to indicate that, correct?
Yeah, like it's a Manitoba housing property. It's on the last page. It does say on page 15 that the rent is subsidized underneath the monthly rent, and where it shows the small suite size, it does say subsidized rent. So yeah, it's not an open market thing. That's why the applicants and the city are just looking at market rents for that type of unit.
When you look at a building like this with 119 suites, 96 of them are bachelor apartments. That would talk to, and very small by my measure, 327 feet. It's not a big apartment.
Right.
Possibly high turnover in these apartments, do you know?
Well, I'm not sure in regards to the turnover because we're not valuing it in its current use that's closed off from everybody and where the rent is subsidized. We're looking at it like what it would go for if anybody could get in there. So yes, the units 100% they're smaller than typical.
Where my question goes is to the wear and tear. If there is a large turnover. Now, I think you put a 60%, which you said was high, but that's maybe not unlikely if you have high turnover and people damaging things when they move out.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have, unfortunately, I haven't inspected the place. We don't have interior photos of this. And I looked through the applicant's brief before this. They don't either. Typically for a building of this vintage, we're not seeing 60% when we're looking at like open market apartments. So 60% is like really quite high. That's often like what I've seen even agents like cap their max expense ratios at. So I suspect it would be high, but without inspecting it, I'm not sure. I just think if a for-profit operator took it over the long term, I don't think they would expect to operate at 60% expense ratio, which is what we're looking at.
I'm certain they wouldn't, but given the circumstances, it may be accurate. And I guess that takes me to the point of if a for-profit operator were to consider a place like this, we've seen a couple of examples where they've taken buildings with many bachelor suites and turned them into one bedrooms, did a major conversion. That would suggest higher risk, higher expenses for the investor, correct?
I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not speculating on what someone might want to physically change it to. Oh, I'm just valuing it what the physical asset is.
I understand that, but we also have to look at if somebody wanted to buy this building. And it's not speculating, it's suggesting that if they wanted to turn those bachelor suites into one bedrooms, there would be additional cost and additional risk for them. That's all I'm asking, if you can answer that.
A risk of turnover or
empty building, having to refill it.
Well, I mean, that would be someone buying this asset, not in the manner in which we're valuing it today. So I wouldn't put any thought going down that road.
I see. Well, and you haven't given that consideration in your cap rate, I think, either.
No, what I'm saying is at a 5.4, what we have is we got rents that are extremely low.
Mhm.
So what we're looking at is April 1st, 2023. Is there really going to be a risk at getting people into a high rise beside Tuxedo Park shopping mall at less than $700? I think the risk is encapsulated with the rent being so low. So to then bump up the cap when we already have super high expenses would be like double dipping. So I think when I look at the overall market value per suite, especially when you take it into tandem, they would be purchasing the whole property. If you go on page 12, see that big green space beside the building, they're getting that too.
Yes.
We don't have a value assigned to that one. We probably should. So that's something I'm sure anyone buying this property would be rubbing their hands together and say, oh man, I'm gonna cut this in half.
Yeah.
Do maybe if I want to fix up 251 in the tower and either build or sell off, and I could build a more a building that's more typical to what the market demands, where they command higher rent. But they also have that opportunity built in. So taking that all into consideration, I think the value is okay.
And I'm sure you were anticipating me going after that plan to land or land to plan ratio, because I always like to ask the question why wasn't it, but you've answered it. I have no other questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions, Mr. Barocas. I know you haven't inspected this property, but do you have anything in your notes as to when it was last inspected?
Let me pull this up quick. Of course, crashes. I do not, but if you want to keep asking me other questions, I'll get you an answer as soon as my program comes back up.
Well, my question about inspection just leads to the very low rent on this property. And I'm just wondering if that's speaking to condition. But if you haven't, if the city hasn't inspected it for a while, then it's just speculative. But
yeah,
that is incredibly low rent.
That is incredibly low rent, especially, for that area. Like, that's one of, at least in my mind, one of the most best sought after areas in the city to live. Let me see here. Okay. I do not have an inspection, unfortunately. I know the suite sizes are quite small, and that's not something that we're trying to brush over or anything.
Right.
But yeah, no inspection. No, sorry.
All right. I thank you. That's all my questions. Ms. Cates, if you would like to give us your brief.
Thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have a summary of some of the facts of the property along with our requested assessment. So we're not disputing the exempt daycare portion of $426,000, but we are requesting a change in the class code 20 to $6,305,000. If you turn to page 6, we have our property site maps. So an aerial map view and then a Google map view showing the location. And then some exterior photos on page 7. Property description on page 8. So the subject property is on edgeland between Tuxedo and Corden. The property is 13 stories, built in the early 70s with 119 units, mostly bachelors. The 2-bedroom would likely be for the property caretaker. And the units are very small, 327 square feet for a bachelor, 431 square feet for a 1-bedroom. If you go to page 13, we have the overview of our income approach. So the property is social housing. It operates on rent geared to income. So the income achieved by the property is not considered to be market level rents. And since we know that the city's modeled rents are taking a proportion of CMHC rents, we're not disputing those. When we're looking at social housing properties, they are going to be lower end finishes than market apartments. They are utility grade. They're built to meet living standards, but they're not going to be up to the standard of other market apartments in the area, as well as the size. So for that reason, given how small these are, being 70% below CMHC would make sense. If the units were larger, maybe we would look at 75 to 80%, but given how small they are, as well as the lower grade finishes that we would expect at this property, I think those rents account for that well. In terms of vacancy, we've applied a market rate. And then in regard to the expenses, when we look at market apartments of this age group, and we've had the chance to review a lot this cycle, the expense ratios do tend to range. When we're looking at 70s builds, anything from 50 to 60% might be within the range we'd expect. And one thing I would note is that when you do have market apartments that are operating on the lower end of the rental range, because the rents are low, the expense ratio tends to be higher. And what we do see a lot in lower end rentals is that they tend to include other things into the rent. So you might see cable, all the utilities included, which again would drive up the expense ratio. So while 60% would be on the higher end, I wouldn't say it's outside of the range that we would see among the market. So in regard to our cap rate, we have some cap rate discussion on pages 14 and 15. So the approach that we take is that we would start with a market rate and adjust upwards for risk factors. That's supported by Appraisal Institute text. The idea being that these properties don't really transact in the market. And when they do, it tends to go from one social housing agency to another. So they have atypical conditions associated. So that is why we've started a market rate, and we'd look at broad factors. The location is not in dispute here, but there are other factors for social housing beyond just location, being low cost or lower quality construction, low income tenancy, age, and then we'd also look at the suite mix as well. So in terms of this property specifically, we would consider adjustments for low income tenancy. The reason being is its relationship with deferred maintenance. These properties are underfunded. They don't earn enough revenues to cover their operating expenses. And so those preventative items of maintenance and repair don't get completed to the same degree as market apartments. And we could see from the assessor's evidence that they haven't taken out a permit on this property since 2008. So that's already quite some time. So if you go to page 18, we have our cap rate for the subject property. So along with low income tenancy for deferred maintenance, I would also consider an adjustment based on the suites, the suite sizes. When we're looking at this property, smaller suites would be less desirable to the market. And when you have primarily bachelor suites that are very small, there's only so much that they can increase the rents. So they are limited in that respect. So we're using a 6% cap rate. So we're doing a 0.5% adjustment. If you go to page 20, so with the NOI of $378,314 and a 6% cap rate, we get our indicated value of $6,305,000 rounded. I did also include our standalone cap rate study for your review. Essentially, from there, we look at market information and what the brokers are saying. And then we've also gone and calculated our own cap rates for your review. And then I guess just to touch on one final point, often in these areas, it's discussed about the land, but realistically, this property is a bit over an acre. If someone was purchasing this, chances are they would be looking at the land value minus the demolition. It's only about a bit over an acre. We're coming in at 6.3 million. So I'd say we're well accounting for the value of the location, the value of the land in this area. Our appendix starts on page 23. And then I've just included some background documentation on what we would use for social housing cap rates. And that would conclude my presentation on this property. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cates. Any questions, Mr. Barocas?
Yes, just on page 6. So I've got the aerial picture at the top. So would you agree that like a knowledgeable purchaser would, or rather also the vendor would assign some value to this developable land north of the improvement?
Yeah, they would assign a value to it. But is it not already being accounted for in the land area that's considered as part of the assessment?
Well, it's not, we're doing the income approach, right? So I don't think that green space is driving the rents or the expenses. Would you consider this excess land?
Well, it's land that's not being used by the current development. I would agree that a purchaser would consider that land, but I guess my point is that even if we consider that land, like we're looking at the land value in this area, if we're at $1 million an acre or whatever, like we're accounting for that in our value. So I do feel that it's accounted for.
Okay. But the income approach you have on page 20, that's just in regards to the income generated by the building itself, is it not?
Yes.
Okay.
But typically, when you're talking about land value, you start going into more of a cost valuation. But yes, the income approach on page 20 would just be looking at this as an apartment.
And then, sorry, I think I heard you say, I didn't see your brief. You said that if you were just looking at the land itself, if the improvement was demolished, did you say it was around 6 million?
I guess to clarify, like, because you were commenting in your presentation that the location is good, someone would like to have the land in this area. So my comment to that was that if someone is looking at this property, they probably aren't looking at it as an apartment. They'd be looking at it at the land. And so by us coming in at 6.3 million, I feel we're well accounting for the value of the location and the land. Not necessarily that the land would sell for 6.3 million. I haven't seen any sales to show that. We are still accounting for it as an apartment, but I feel that the locational elements are taken into account.
All right, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Whitbread, any questions?
Yeah, I'd like to explore this notion that the assessor made in his presentation about people lined up to get into this building because it's such a desirable area. And he repeated that a number of times. These are low-income people, a low-income tenancy. There are no cut-rate discounted grocery stores or department stores anywhere near this property. I think it's a Safeway, actually, or a Sobeys, a couple of blocks away. There are no hospitals. There's no clinics that I'm aware of. The things that a low-income tenant might need, and they only have a bus to go by. As we can see, there are not a lot of them that own cars with, what is it, 71 parking spots? So would you agree that this is a really desirable building for low-income tenancy?
I would agree that it's a desirable location in general. But I see your point. I don't know if I would agree that it's specifically desirable for that tenancy. I guess I was just trying to make clear in my presentation that I wasn't disputing the location as part of the cap rate, but that our cap rate disputes were coming into play from other factors.
Well, that would take me to another factor then, the condition of the building. Did you say yourself you've been in the building?
I haven't been in the building. I was just kind of going by permit records, stuff we had on file in terms of improvements, and I didn't really see anything of substance since that 2008 permit of the property. So typically in those cases, the units do get quite run down over time without that investment, especially with a high-rise 119 units. That would be a lot to maintain. So I would probably place the condition in somewhere between average to below average, acknowledging that some units are going to be better and some are going to be worse, but probably would be somewhere on that spectrum.
Would you be able to comment on the nature of turnover on a low tenancy building such as this? There's likely a higher turnover when you have a low income tenancy.
Yeah, I would say it does depend too on the type of suites, but I would say based on the ones that we have gone to see that are mostly bachelors, those would see more turnover than probably the family style housing. But in terms of the specific turnover at this property, it would be hard to comment specifics. But I would I would probably assume that there would be more turnover here than at the larger units that we would see.
Mm, I'll leave it there for now. Thanks. No further questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And Ms. Penner, any questions?
I don't know why I'm a little hung up on this point, but the parking situation, there's a really low number of parking stalls for this building relative to the number of suites, and I don't know that that would be an issue for low-income housing, as maybe there's less vehicle ownership. But if we're looking at this on a market basis, would you say potentially some of that whatever we would call it, excess or surplus land, would need to be used for parking?
Yeah, I would say if this was operated on a market basis, the expectation typically outside of the downtown is that you'd have at least one-to-one parking. So they are below that. So I think that that kind of excess space would probably have to be utilized as parking if this operated on a market basis.
Yeah, I don't have too much. That was all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I just have a question, Ms. Cates. To the best of your knowledge, have you ever known of any Manitoba or Winnipeg housing buildings that have been converted to market?
There is one that I'm aware of. That would be 185 Smith. In terms of others, not off the top of my head. Typically when we're seeing these buildings sell, they're typically selling from one social housing to the other. We don't see them sell as often to the market unless there's extreme scenarios, because it kind of diminishes the social housing stock. But with 185 Smith, where they just didn't have the funding to bring it up, they did sell that to the private market, and after a lot of investment, it was converted.
All right, thank you. Mr. Barocas, I'm just going to redirect to you, and I'm just going to pose the same question.
You're muted, Matthew.
Yeah, echoing, what Farah said as well. They're, from what I understand, they're not in the business of selling these places off. We need more of them. So, other than 185 Smith, there's not any that I know of.
All right, I thank you. Does either party have a wish for a summation?
I'm okay.
As well, thank you.
All right, I thank you. We will then move on to 528 Hudson Street. And we are looking at assessed value for this property.
Okay, thank you very much. File 24-2972, roll number 03065813500528 Hudson. Another Manitoba housing property. 8,923,000, 1976, no effective year built, 123 suites, 74 outdoor parking spots. Construction class C masonry bearing walls. It is a two-story building. And we go to page 3, and you have our income work up there. And let me just do a double check to make sure that, yes, we have the same net operating income. So it's a cap rate talk. Again, 5.4 is the modeled cap, 110 bachelor, 12 one bed, 1 2. So again, another predominantly bachelor type structure. So then we've got the CMHC rent analysis on 5 and 6. So we're 81% of the 3-factor analysis here taken as an average. So again, we got this knocked down in the model. Not quite as low as the other one, but I think this one's at below average. It's got small suites as well. But it looks like based on permits, you'll see later, it has had some work done to it. So then 7 is the source tables, 8 and 9 are cap rate charts, and then on page 11, there's a permit in 2016 where they did some work to the exterior alterations. I don't know why they're calling them towers because it's a 2-story. They did some roofing and put on a new membrane, new rooftop unit on one building, electrical work. They replaced the windows where they were damaged. So it's like looks like it's a maintenance permit more than anything. It's not contending that it's been upgraded. And then another permit from 2001 rather, to show that they did some work as well in terms of doors and windows. But again, those are already 24 years old. The physical reference they were looking at 23 years old actually. So that's what we got for permits. And then on the last page here, we've got just the breakdown. So you see that it is subsidized. It's 400 square foot for the bachelor and studio. And the 1-bedroom is 500 square foot. So again, pretty small, subsidized rent. So it's not open to everyone. There's a picture at the end of my brief showing the building. It's in the Fort Garry area, so it's not in the same area as the last one. So overall, we are at 72,544 per unit as per the model. We're 80% of CMHC rent, and we are at 54.5% of the expenses. So we got the expenses higher because we know that it is based on what we've seen. These places take a bit more wear and tear than a normal place. So haven't inspected it, don't know the physical condition, but we're assuming that it's a bit more worn down. That's my evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. And any questions, Ms. Cates?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Penner?
Questions for me, thank you.
And Mr. Whitbread?
No, thank you.
Just some clarification, Mr. Barocas. What was the square footage on the 1-bedroom?
Oh, yeah, on page 13, it's 500 square feet.
All right, thank you. And you don't have anything in your records as to when it was last inspected?
Yeah, we don't have any records of it.
Okay.
Madam Chair, when you're done, I'll have a question.
Yes, I am done. Go ahead.
Matthew or Mr. Barocas, I'm looking at the document on page 13, and I just noticed this. It passed me by before. Meal plan program details. You can actually have lunch and dinner somewhere in this building. Is that the case? There's a central dining room?
I'm not sure. I haven't inspected it, but I mean, that's not something that we're not valuing it in its current use. We're looking at it as a open to everybody for-profit place. So that's not a avenue I pursued in my analysis.
No, but if there was a big commercial kitchen in there, that would have some impact, would it not?
It would have an effect.
On a for-profit coming in to want to modify this.
It might if they started running the kitchen.
Or
Is
not
that what you're saying?
wanting to take it out. That's fine. Ms. Cates may have an answer. Thank you. I have no other questions.
Thank you. Ms. Cates, if you would like to give us your brief.
Thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have our requested assessment of $8,031,000. On page 4, under the scope of work, I did go to see this property, including an interior and exterior inspection in May of 2023. On page 6, we have some property site maps and then some exterior photos that I took on page 7, and then a pictometry view on page 8. So you could see that the property is almost split off into different wings. This is something that we see in certain seniors housing properties, where they kind of have a central area and then they have the units kind of off in different sides. On page 9, property description. So the subject is on the east side of Hudson Street, south of Chevrier in the Maybank area. It is a 2-story building built in the mid-70s with 123 units, primarily bachelors. We note the suites are approximately 400 square feet for a bachelor and 500 square feet for a 1-bedroom. And there are 74 surface parking stalls noted. On page 14, we have the overview of our income approach. So the similar logic to the prior property, we're not disputing the NOI in this case, and we're focusing on the cap rate. So we have our same cap rate discussion on pages 15 through to 18. On page 19, we have our cap rate for the subject. So we're applying a cap rate of 6%. We're considering 0.25 adjustment for low income tenancy deferred maintenance, and then a 0.25% adjustment to account for the seniors housing in terms of small suites, but also in terms of the institutional design. So properties like this would have functional obsolescence when we're looking at the excess of common area, especially kitchen space. If this was operating on the market, that would be seen as an excess and it would be inferior to the market because, you know, it's not generating income like having more units would be. Excuse me. At the site visit, we were able to talk to the caretaker, and he did note that there was deferred maintenance in regard to the elevator systems as well. There's corroded pipes that need replacement, but they just did not have the funding. But he did note that the roof and windows had been replaced in the last 10 years. We would expect those items to be replaced every probably 20-ish years or so. So that would be a standard. And then they said that an air intake system was also put in over the last few years. Page 21, we have our income approach. So with an NOI of $481,855 and a 6% cap rate, we get an indicated value of $8,031,000. I did also include an additional supplemental document for this property. The reason that was included is because it shows that an adjustment was made for low-income tenancy and for functional obsolescence for a similar well-located social housing property. So I've included that just as additional documentation for our adjustments here. And then on page 23, we have our appendix. So we have the site visit photos. So it just starts with some common area, as well as the unit example. So unit example on page 30. So you could see that it's fairly basic finishes. And you could see like just an alternate style too on page 35, I believe. There's just a couple different layouts of this property. And then, yeah, so we were able to see a vacated unit, an occupied unit. And that would conclude my presentation on this property. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cates. Any questions, Mr. Barocas?
I do not have any questions.
Thank you. And Ms. Penner?
Questions for me, thank you.
And Mr. Whitbread?
Yes, I'm looking at page 24, 28, both pages of your presentation, and this would seem to indicate a central dining area. And kind of a commercial kitchen setup. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. Yeah, they do have a central area. This property is kind of tailored toward seniors housing, so they tend to, yeah, have that kind of excess common area. Yeah, so there's quite a bit of common area at this property as well.
You have any idea what the tenancy percentage would be for seniors, or is it all seniors?
I believe it is all seniors. When we went to go see the property, they didn't indicate that it was open to everyone. I believe this is a tailored for seniors property.
And so I'm just trying to find there we are. We have the kitchens are very abbreviated kitchens, aren't they? They're very small.
Yes,
Yeah,
I would agree.
sort of a stove, a fridge, sink, and if you put your own microwave in by the looks of it, it's hard to say if there are even any cupboards, like above counter cupboards. Okay. Sorry, I'm just flipping through your photos. I'm fine. I have no other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have no questions. Does either party have a wish for a summation?
No, thank you.
As well, thank you.
All right. So both items on the docket have been heard this evening, and this hearing is adjourned. And I would like to thank you, Ms. Cates and Mr. Brokus, for your briefs.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.